We're imposing restrictions on models that have, like you say, a very singular purpose. But down the road, we want our agents to have volition and make decisions, and they're going to get better and better at that.
Agreed. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge too, because I think a lot of people want the kind of advantage of an agent. With fine-grained authorization specifically, it's going to be a multi-approach. There's going to need to be permissions that are put in place by the human instantiating the agent, right? This person who's starting the request. They're going to have to put guardrails in place. And that could just be expressed a lot of times through language. And we do that kind of today.
What mix of skills should they be looking to have within the organization in order to have effective permission systems for AI tools?
It's different than your traditional IAM stuff. Traditionally in security and IAM, it's the person who controls the service and they're kind of dictating access to a degree, and with a healthy dose of business influence of what the business wants to achieve. The difficulty is that there's not a lot of people who are deep experts on any of this, but there's very few people in the world who are really deeply understanding, the intricacies of how these LLMs are working and how they're going to navigate, when you ask it to do something, what it specifically is it going to do. There's always going to be a place for your traditional, identity and access management folks for figuring out, hey, like how is this request supposed to come in? How are we supposed to give it the agent an identity or the human identity? That's going to be necessary.
Welcome to the Security Strategist Podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Richard Stiennon, and I will be your host for this episode. I'm the Chief Research Analyst at IT Harvest, an author and a trusted advisor to vendors, VCs, and private equity firms. In this episode, once again, joining us is Jeffrey Hickman, Head of Customer Engineering at Ori. In the previous episode with Jeff, host and Coopinger Cole cybersecurity expert Alejandro Leal talked about customer identity and access management, CIAM, AI agents, and the urgent need for a new type of self-managed identity solutions. Today, we're continuing that discussion. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Richard. Happy to be here.
I'm anxious to jump into this conversation because it's near and dear to my heart. So let's start by talking about going beyond current authorization standards like OAuth 2. What basic change is needed in how we define and enforce permissions for AI agents to ensure they respect human or machine intent? And maybe, backtrack a little and talk about human or AI agents and why they're something that we have to be concerned about.
This is a really interesting challenge. It kind of coincidentally over the weekend, I was reading a lot of kind of social media posts around different development groups and people working a lot with AI agents. And something that popped up quite frequently was AI agents going out of their bounds, whether that was intentionally due to a malicious actor or unintentionally just due to the way that the initial AI agent was structured. So I think permissions are going to quickly rise to the top of the stack of things that implementers of AI agents are going to have to worry about. And some of that is kind of built into, OAuth and authorization. You can have scopes and stuff like that. But what we're seeing is kind of a deeper level. It was kind of an interesting point that was made is that, a lot of people are treating AI agents kind of like your next web app, right? You wrap the MCP server around it, you deploy it, and there you go. And it should have some of the built-in controls because the SDKs and things like that. But what people are finding is there's a lot of avenues because these AI agents are autonomous and they'll make up decisions and kind of try to find ways to solution things with the best of intentions, that people can find ways around the controls that you've put in place, whether it be permission-based or even sometimes prompt-based controls, right, for handling things like prompt injection. So I think this is really becoming quickly one of the top issues for people developing AI agents. I don't think it's a solved issue in the space as well. I think it's definitely something that's going to take some iteration and some nuance and thought about how we want AI agents to respond. And let me give one more illustrative example of what I mean by this. There's the easy AI agents today. And what I mean by easy is that they're kind of single purpose. They're built for a specific task. Maybe they're ragging off of a specific set of documents and they're just responding to that. And they're an internal tool. And that's one level of permissions. What do you need around those permissions? Maybe you need who can access what documents from a RAG perspective, who can talk to the AI agent, things along those lines, what the AI agent can grab and retrieve from a document source, things like that. But then there's this second generation of AI agents, which are doing actions autonomously for users out there on the web in the greater scheme of things. those are the ones where I think there's going to be a lot more nuance that are needed. Not to say that there's not nuance needed in the first use case as well, but more specifically for those ones that are out there doing actions on behalf of users, I think that's going to be a really interesting problem to watch evolve. And we have some ideas. I have some ideas around how that can work, and the industry does as a whole. But I definitely think it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I was planning some travel recently, and of course, people are talking about eventually agents replacing travel agents, which of course have been replaced a long time ago. But I guess be reintroducing travel agents, and therefore they're making financial decisions and authorizations on your behalf. And then how do you find out later that you had a reservation at a hotel in a city you weren't in? How do you go back and who's got the blame for accepting that charge on the credit card in the first place? It's going to get complicated fast.
Definitely. Definitely, for sure.
Yeah. I worry about the infrastructure because a single user can create multiple agents. They might have tools and processes to create hundreds, if not thousands of agents. So won't that increase the demand on the identity infrastructure? And, you talked about CIAM before, which is usually treated separately from employee access or privileged user access. What happens when instead of 1,000 identities, you've got 10 million identities?
I think that's a really, really big problem that we'll start to see more and more. I was actually, again, this weekend doing a little bit of search as well around, there were some different news events and things happening around the world. And I was curious to look and see if there was a spike in AI traffic during the time of people, if we're starting to see that shift yet on news consumption or current event consumption being done through chat agents, right? Because there's kind of this idea out there that people are getting their news, or at least a better understanding, a deeper understanding of the current news from chat. I haven't seen anything yet. I'll kind of look to see over the next couple of weeks to see if there's anything, anyone doing any of that analysis. I unfortunately don't have the background to do that type of analysis on that side. But I think it illustrates a good point because my intuition is that whether or not the people are going out there and using the chat agents to do that research or to gain that deeper understanding, there's still a ton of AI agents that are going through different publications and pulling information, whether that's intentional based on a query of a user or just as part of the learning process of different AI agents. And you're going to see a deeper proliferation of this. Maybe not necessarily from the big guys, right? Maybe not from, OpenAI or Anthropic or Mistral or whoever, right? You may not see it from them directly, but there's a lot of people running their own LLMs and their own AI agents, and a lot of startups, a lot of small companies building this, and for that matter, a lot of large enterprises. All that, right, is just pure agents, and then combined with some humans occasionally asking and tasking these agents, yeah, you're definitely looking at this huge exponential growth of access traffic. I'm remembering a chart that I saw last year, I think it was 2024, was the first time that bot traffic on the internet purely outstriped human traffic, right? It was like something like 54% bot traffic, right? Compared to, whatever the human piece was. And at first I was kind of like, man, are people just not using the internet? Is it just because they're through like all chat interfaces? And then it dawned on me like, no, it's not just chat interface. Like they're just getting consumption a different way. It's actually just total volume of internet traffic is increasing as well, right? So, the dynamics are shifting around that. So I think you hit something really salient there, which is like the scale problem. Definitely going to be a really big thing. And maybe the best way to start tackling that is making sure you have like a good system that can scale from whether that be identity or just APIs or like we just talked about, even permissions, having a system that can scale and handle the amount of decision and logic that has to happen to what AI agents can access and who can access them. For sure.
Cool. And to your point about news, I just issued a press release this morning, and the PR or the press release newswire in their dashboard gave me a big, button for a channel, which was called ChatGPT. So I clicked on that. It opened a ChatGPT discussion with the question, "Did you read this press release?" So of course I hit enter. And it comes back and says, "Yes, I've read that." And I said, "Did you recognize that you also wrote it?" Because, of course, ChatGPT did write it. And it said, "Yes, I noticed the distinctive style." But there's, news consumption via AI predated LLMs, and that somebody at Feedly, who I partner with on something, can train their internal AIs using their machine learning, not large language models, on news feeds. And they've been using that for several years.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how quickly we spun away from the words machine learning into AI now, right? For everything, when machine learning was kind of the forefront, or really the genesis of what we now call LLMs and AI. A different application, but at the core,
it was a complete breakoff, right? Is because we were pursuing machine learning and reinforcement learning, and then somebody discovered transformers, and that just changed everything, right? It's like unusual. And in our world of security, machine learning is Bayesian analysis, right? It's just statistics, no big deal. But yeah, and LLMs are just totally different and don't apply to the kind of things we see in logs. So here's a question. When agents work with all these different tools and have access to all these resources and data, what level of fine-grained authorization is needed, considering the unpredictable nature of what they need access to, how the models work, and they're going to change, right? The models are going to get smarter. So we're imposing restrictions on models that have, like you say, a very singular purpose. But down the road, we want our agents to have volition and make decisions, and they're going to get better and better at that.
Agreed. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge too, because I think a lot of people want the kind of advantage of an agent, like the thing that people go, oh, this is really cool, is it can go out and discover how to do something, right? You can give it something as plain human information, and it goes, hey, like, let me figure out how to do that, right? Let me use these different tools, these different resources and pieces like that. I think with fine-grained authorization specifically, it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. I think there's going to need to be permissions that are put in place by the human instantiating the agent, right? This person who's starting the request. They're going to have to put guardrails in place. And that could just be expressed a lot of times through language. And we do that kind of today. Like, hey, I want you to go research this, but don't use these sources because, I don't agree with these sources or something like that. Or, harkens back to when I was in school a long time ago and Wikipedia was burgeoning, and your teacher would say, Wikipedia is not a reliable source, right? So you tell it, don't research that source. Nowadays, I don't think that's quite the case so much anymore. But, that's something that you have that first kind of line of defense. And your LLM should be able to understand that. But then there's a kind of a second level, which is, okay, look, the person, the human in the loop, pose the prompt, pose the question, pose the ask, right? The LLM then needs to decide, are they even allowed to do that at a kind of machine level, right? Take the context away for a moment, right? And just look at what the root request pieces are. Are they allowed to do that? That's another layer, right? And then now we have to add the context back in and figure out, okay, with the context understood, can I still achieve the goal, right? And if so, then I got to go out to all these tools and resources. And then that's a whole nother layer of authorization. The tool gets the request from the agent and it goes, is this agent allowed to do it? Maybe the agent is, but then is that human allowed to do it, right? On top of it. So I think there's going to be multiple gates and multiple checks throughout this entire process to ensure that there is the right level of access, the right level of authorization. I think for some tools, we as long as they're simple, like, hey, get me the weather. Okay, fine, right? Who's restricted from that? That'll be an easy case. But I think payments, and you talked about travel agents earlier and kind of booking that. I think that's where it gets really interesting. And we've seen why Google came out with the agent to pay protocol. MasterCard did a press release around their agent pay. I think Visa's partnering with a few other people as well around payments for AI agents and how that's going to work. That's the space I think that's going to lead the forefront on this, because, they don't want to be losing, money and dealing with the attribution of, to your point, of like who authorized that charge, right? Who was that? Yes, there was a human in the loop, but maybe the human didn't direct specifically that behavior. Who should be at fault for that? I think that's what's going to drive a lot of this on that side. But in the meantime, before we're there, right, you still got to build models that work. And I think like we traditionally look at this as like a role-based thing. Like, does the user have the role to do this? Do they, are they a buyer? Are they a purchaser? Whatever the deal is. I think that type of stuff is going to have to really go by the wayside. I think using something like the Zanzibar model for relationship-based fine-grained authorization is probably a better way to go because it gives you a lot more flexibility. You could still do role-based stuff if you want with it, but it gives you a lot more of that one-to-one, right? Tool to user, tool to agent, whatever type of mapping that you want. Still lets you do hierarchical mapping and stuff like that. I think that's a better system. how that gets transmitted between the agent, the human, the service, the tool, whatever it is, that's a big question, right? Do we throw it in the token? Does it an external service that you call? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there, particularly. I think what's important first is defining what that model looks like from a permissions perspective, and then building, the protocol or however it communicates. That's just implementation details. But if you don't understand that relationship map, if you don't understand how things are supposed to relate and how they're supposed to talk to each other, and then maybe be able to add in context and occasion as well, then it doesn't matter what technical implementation you go down. It's really important to understand that initial model first.
Yeah, my head's beginning to hurt a little bit here. There's a lot of dimensions. So in a traditional IT world, we think of access control. So the owner of a workload or an asset, digital asset, determines who is allowed to, who with what credentials is allowed to access a resource. Great, all that. And that who could be, so it should be no problem if it's an agent or a human. You just recognize it's an agent. Maybe we'll only allow it these types of things. No big deal. But when we're turning it around and saying that the user, the owner of the agent, has to put those guardrails around it, that's, new capability, functionality that we haven't really had before. And it gets complicated as whose responsibility it is. If there's payment agent protocols and guidelines being written, that sounds like, the banks are going to determine what kind of responsibilities they will give or make available for agents down the road. There are a lot more parties involved than there used to be. It used to be the owner and the buyer of the data, and that you work something out and enforce your requirements.
Definitely. Yeah, kind of, I was thinking the other day too about like just evolutions in technology that we've gone over my lifetime as well. And like one of the big ones I think is relatively similar to this is like the advent of like the full smartphone, right? The full, kind of, I would even argue even before the first iPhone, there was, devices like BlackBerry devices and stuff, and they started changing right then and there how we interacted with information, right? Like the phone kind of brought your library to your pocket, right? The AI agents changing how we consume understanding, right? It's kind of like putting a conversational bent on how you understand stuff rather than just consuming information. You're having a conversation about it, which is different from how we traditionally do that. And I think what's interesting for companies to think about with this, and like it kind of ties into like, hey, we have all these different parties that need to control about it, is, a lot of people realize in the smartphone era, especially when apps took off, that if you're not on a person's home screen, you might as well not exist to a degree, right? Like if you're not there in the forefront, right? If you're not something that they're using, like think of all the social media sites, right? Like think as they fall off, they're no longer, the people uninstall the app. It's not on the home screen. You don't have an app. People who won in those early days in different verticals, and I'll say one in general is kind of the people who were there mobile first, who were able to take advantage of that, who became popular, right? Either through word of mouth and social media, or just because they had an app and no one else did and offered an alternative. And so people realized that, and they built apps, and they realized that's a part of doing business. I think AI is kind of going down the same path, but I think there's another angle with it, which is interesting to me, which is the devices, right? The mobile devices. Like it's you building an app. And if you're not on the app store, people don't think about you, right? Oh, you don't have an app, I'll go to their website maybe, or something like that. With AI, it's a little different though. If you're not controlling the narrative, if you're not controlling what LLMs know about you, if you're not controlling how AI agents access you, the LLM is just going to do what it wants to do, right? It's going to gather information about you from other sources, right? And it's just going to come up with stuff, right? That's what it does to a degree, right? And you can put a lot of guardrails around hallucinations and stuff like that. But if you're not controlling that conversation at the same time, if you're not offering those services, the LLM is going to be incentivized by the user to go out there and try to figure out a way to do something, right? I've seen a lot of early days, and a lot of people are backing away from this, and there's still a few of them out there doing it. But I've seen a lot of AI agents that do things like web scraping and form interacting, right, through a browser plugin. That's because the service that they're trying to attach and tackle doesn't offer a way for the agent to interface, right? And this is like before MCP, before A2A, before things like that started coming out. But even still, they exist. And so it shows you that people are going to find a way to interact with your service. And if you're not there as part of that conversation, then you might miss out, or there might be, ways that agents treat you. They might prefer the tool integrations through MCP or whatever before they prefer the scraping, or who knows, right? Because it's maybe more secure, more standardized. And I think the same thing is going to happen with the permission stuff, right? If you're too permissive or not permissive enough, right, the AI agent's going to know what it can use and how it can use it. And if you don't have it right, that's going to be a challenge too as well. So I think there's a really big incentive for organizations to figure this part out as well, because just as much as playing in the field, you got to figure out what you got to offer and how you're going to offer it and how it's going to interact, so that it's predictable to the human. May not be predictable to the machine. The machine is going to do what it's going to do, right, to a degree, but the human has to be able to understand it at the end of the day. And so if that's not clear as well, that's going to be difficult, and then going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations, I think.
And the organizations doing that, what mix of skills should they be looking to have within the organization in order to have effective permission systems for AI tools?
Yeah, I think it's different than your traditional IAM stuff. We talked a little bit earlier about hey, traditionally in security and IAM, it's the person who controls the service and they're kind of dictating access to a degree, and with a healthy dose of business influence, right, of what the business wants to achieve, right? You're kind of figuring those pieces out. I think that the difficulty is that there's not a lot of people who are deep experts on any of this. I'm not a deep expert on this. I would say more of a hobbyist with a really deep-seated want to see this solutioned and figured out on that side. But there's very few people in the world who are really deeply understanding the intricacies of how these LLMs are working and how they're going to navigate. When you ask it to do something, what it specifically is it going to do? Right? There's whole companies based around this. So when we think about hey, what skills do we need? I think there's always going to be a place for your traditional, identity and access management folks for figuring out, hey, how is this request supposed to come in? How are we supposed to give it the agent an identity or the human identity? That's going to be necessary. There's always going to be the business to understand what they actually want to expose from to an AI agent or to an LLM or things along those lines, or how they want to get into the AI world from a business perspective. And that, as we all know, drives a lot of things, right? From what the business wants to do on that side. I think you're going to need to have people who understand AI agents and LLMs and their natures. Maybe not at a super deep level, but you're much like we've had business analysts, right, and data analysts for years that are looking at statistical data in purchasing patterns or advertisement patterns and things like that. I wouldn't be surprised to see a class of people that start to arise out of this AI era that are experts in understanding how LLMs are coming to a decision based on the data and the prompt that it's given, right? Based on specific models. Or in the very least, being able to look at agent AI behavior patterns and then how to apply your own services that you're offering to make them more attractive. I mean, we've seen this years ago with SEO, right? With data searching for when the crawlers were going across the web to do search ranking, right? And people figured out real quickly, we can kind of tune the system. I'll use that friendly word. We can tune the system, right, to get better results. I think, and you're already starting to see that with things like llm.txt on websites, right, to figure out how it interacts better with those LLMs. So I think you're going to start seeing a class of people that, and I think it's kind of needed as well, people who understand how these agents kind of work from a behavioral standpoint, maybe not intricately, but at least how they interact in general, so that when you're making decisions around, hey, we want to offer this service, they can be the voice of reason to a sense and say, hey, you need to guardrail it this way. You need to put these permissions in place. And if you're going to allow things like, image upload, you need to make sure that people can't embed data in the image that the agent's going to go crazy off of, right? So I think those are kind of the three skills, obviously, business leaders who are going to make the decisions, who are going to say, this is where the business needs to go. Someone to help analyze the LLM, the data, the way that things are working, and what agents are expected to do. And then identity and access people, that to kind of control and implement guardrails around that. I think that's where that's going to sit. You will have operational people to, support the services and deploy them and things like that. But as far as people who are kind of gating and controlling access and how that works, I think those are the three primary entities that I would see doing that.
Awesome. So last question. If you had to summarize the main concerns and immediate priorities about AI agent permissions for CISOs in a 60-second message, what would that message be?
Yeah, I think today the biggest one that I would be worried about outside of specific FGA, like fine-grained authorization needs, is prompt injection. I think that's the most overlooked thing. A lot of that can be done with putting proper fine-grained permissions in place around things like uploading of data, if agents can do that to your service or stuff like that. But I think prompt injection is probably the most existential threat that people don't always think about. And because it's a lot to think about. Like I mentioned earlier, uploading images that are potentially asking the agent to do something in the image, but you didn't think to guardrail the image because it's an image processor. Things along those lines that are kind of the first step. I think the second line is just a basic, if your service, if your AI agents or your integrations with agents needs a human in the loop at some point, then at least have some sort of guardrails to identify that human and the authorization they have. Even if it's simple stuff like using OAuth scopes and passing a token through, like an MCP call or something like that, to understand that the human can do, these 5 things as the agent acting behalf of them. I think those are important. And then lastly, I would really look into things around what are called like know your agent. This idea that you don't want to accept every agent out there in the world because some of them might be malicious. There are some open source different bodies that are putting together directories of known good agents. They're signing them digitally as well to say, hey, these are known good agents that you can use or at least been attested to in a directory or a repository. And then having ways to control like things like dynamic client registration. And I know there's a lot of work that's going on in that world right now around client registration for OAuth and stuff like that. So those are the kind of 3 to 4 things I'd really be focused on as a CISO.
Awesome. I love that known good agents. They should put in parentheses for now.
For now. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us today. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot away from this podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, please head over to ory.com, O-R-Y.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head over to em360tech.com.